hey, massa, if can I buy my freedom because I want to go marry that, that bitch across the road? I'm like, okay, well, she's a free woman, you're a freaking slave. Like, well, what if I do all that work really, really hard, massa? Well, you can work really, really hard. Why don't you work really, really hard right now? Like, well, I'd get all depressed if I didn't know I was going to get my freedom. I don't work as hard. It's like, okay, well, I could beat you to death and try to get you to work harder. That's probably not as good an incentive as you just fucking working hard.
Man, it's crazy, nigga.
That's a good
Yep.
impression.
There's not much you can't demonstrate if the standard is concocting a logically coherent fictitious scenario. That's why I've got such a dim view of deontology and a bunch of other theories, because like you give me a long enough set of trolley tracks and enough switches and I can disprove any.
Fucked up.
Using it to in service of proving anything about like wealth inequality necessarily. I don't know what like that specific convo was at. Like I came in when you guys were quibbling about whether or not food insecurity had a definition,
Right.
which like a quick Google search seems to show that it does.
Yeah, the food insecurity thing came from poverty, right? Because we were having a discussion about if and why wealth inequality is bad in the U.S. And the guy said it was because, it contributes to poverty. It's like, well, okay, if people below the poverty line still have their needs met, then you have an established. We already know that some people have more. The definition of why is it bad? And if the poor people have their needs, met, you haven't said anything. He's like, well, okay, poverty is necessarily bad. We're like, well, no, it's just a metric. You have to give us qualities. And then he went to food insecurity, and we're like, well, food insecurity is another, term of art. It doesn't mean malnutrition, because that's a number that we can measure. So what does it mean? And that's kind of where So it's kind of trying to pin down what it is that wealth inequality in the United States is alleged to cause, such that people rail against it. And I don't think a lot of people have thought it out. I think people say the term wealth inequality and point to the fact that it exists and act as if that's all that they have to say.
Yeah, I mean, like the thing that's like obviously agreeable about wealth inequality is just simply that it generates a scenario in which there are like differing levels of quality of life from person to person within a society, right? We can bare minimum agree to that.
That's practically included in the definition, right? Like
yeah.
Wealth is so closely tied to quality of life, practically tautological to say that.
Yeah, exactly. We're just getting to like the bare minimums of agreement, right? Yeah, for the most part, I'm with you on your assessment. I don't know what like the other guy's large point is necessarily. Like it stands to reason for me that if we considered like healthcare, like easy healthcare access as like a new bare minimum thing that we wanted within our society, and we looked at like wealth inequality as like a measurement by which we could say, okay, well, there's this like giant pool of money in this location that seems to be generated by our society in one way or another. Would it be reasonable to access this in some way to pay for everybody's health care? Yes or no, right? And so it's like at that point, are we determining whether or not our like tax rates are made in the proper way? It's a big reason why a lot of people seem to be mulling over.
I mean, there's two things you consider there.
What's it called? Long-term capital gains taxes are like even remotely reasonable or not.
Debating over like when and if you should grab some of the money from a really person and use it to pay for something like through taxes is kind of a side issue to whether or not wealth inequality is bad, right?
Well, sorry, you were cutting out. You were talking about rich people specifically, right?
I think I heard.
I mean, I could argue that wealth because it generates billionaires tax.
Bernie Sanders has proposed a bill about the one-time billionaire tax.
Okay.
If anybody would want to read up on that, I think it's on his website.
Thanks.
Yeah, so the wealth inequality thing, it's always going to be like indexed to the overall like way in which a society is being taken care of. right?
Well, so for example, like using your standard of necessity from the earlier conversation, we can imagine a universe where space travel is easy, and so every human has the human, and some people on that earth put in a crazy amount of work to generate factories and pleasure palaces and amazing, and other people use their earth and lay around. Basically, all they do. So you would have massive amounts of, but a very poor argument to show that wealth inequality is somehow bad. Being
sure. Yeah, I mean, like the current situation, it like plays out in like the United States versus like I don't know, fucking Zimbabwe or whatever the country is that has like the like $100 million like currency, right? Like wealth inequality in the United States is not nearly as bad as like wealth inequality in the nation where like the poorest people like basically are starving on the streets, right?
You could imagine a country in which everybody's starving on.
Well, Syrup, it's
Sure.
actually exactly the opposite. If you want to look at countries that are where you have people starving to death, like for example Venezuela, those are countries that have a very high level of income equality, not inequality.
Well, no, there would be instances of both for both, right? It's not that like one begets like a specific situation, because there are countries that have much more equitable like socioeconomic groups, like Norway or Sweden, where people are a lot more even out relative to the United States, where they have reportedly higher qualities of life than people in the United States, as an example, right? It doesn't mean that like the wealth inequality is bad in that scenario. It seems like they've figured out a system that works for them, and it represents like a good thing for them. Whereas in like the scenario of Venezuela that you're bringing up, like, okay, there's like other factors at play there that seem to be contributing to the overall poor situation that people have there.
So Syrup, when you say like, oh, they have like a better quality of life, you have to say, well, what constitutes a better quality of life? And a lot of it's going to be preference. So in America, we value a lot of disposable income, and they don't have a lot of disposable income. Usually it's a lot of benefits. Now you have disposable income, but it's nowhere near the same amount than in America. And that's preference. Some people prefer the preference of quality of life we get here. Some people prefer the giant welfare state and like the Nordic countries. It's all preference. I'm not saying one better than the other, but it's preference.
Yeah, that's fine. I like mostly I would just look at like if we define like a series of quantifiable metrics, like perhaps not simply just like access to healthcare, right? But like the like how healthy is a nation overall, right? As like one such metric, or like what are the rates of heart disease by like X age or something within a country? Like we could look at things like that as like measurable things that we could determine as like a quality of life indicator.
I wouldn't say that's a great metric. I think access to care would be a better metric. And the reason I say that is that you could find people on islands who eat nothing but a pescatarian diet, but have access to fucking nothing else, but live super fucking long. Why? Because their diet's on point, and their activity's on point.
Sure. Yeah, I'm not saying it's the only, I'm not saying it's the best. I'm just like listing it as a metric. That's all.
Right, like
and it would be one among many.
And I bring that up because, like, in a lot of Nordic countries, because we have a lot of Nordic people on this freaking server, most of them are women. They talk about like how they walk everywhere. Like they don't, most of them don't have vehicles, and they'll just freaking walk or take the bus or some combination of the two. And that means you're getting your steps in. In America, you have like most households have like more than one vehicle, right? And we usually sit in a chair all day in an air-conditioned office or a house, and then we drive in a car that's air conditioning, and we sit a lot. And so we're probably going to need healthcare way more than these people because we have a really dog shit diet most of the time out of our preference, and we are very sedentary out of our preference. So
it's not just preference, right? A lot of it is specifically your environment. It's hot as fuck in Florida. I don't want to walk anywhere. right? It's all hot all over a lot of the
You
U.S.
just said you don't want to, which is preference.
I'm not capable of walking anywhere without either smelling like shit whenever I get wherever I'm going, right, or like dehydrating like a
Yeah, you
prude
don't want to
whenever
smell
I'm
like shit,
going.
that's called
It's
preference.
it is oppressively hot everywhere in Florida.
Yeah, that's called preference.
The thing that
Okay.
it's not simply just preference, right? Preference is like a result of whatever
Yeah, I have a
input
preference
you
of
have
not
to
hating my life,
stimuli,
yeah.
right? So if
I don't know
you
why
live in
you're
an
arguing
area,
over this.
real
Not
quick,
smelling
real
like
quick.
shit
So
and having
you're
a funny shirt is
choosing-
literally preference.
So if
You're
you live in an
choosing to
area,
not smell like shit. That's preference.
so real quick, like let's say you lived in an area.
I mean, Indians,
where-
like, it's excessively hot in India, and they still choose to smell like shit. I mean, preference. Bro.
So if you lived in an area, so take like so like New York City is implementing congestion pricing, right? Let's say that was expanded and it became like increasingly expensive to drive into the city. So the new norm became taking public transit into the city instead. Your experience within that city, because of the policies, is going to be such that you're in an environment where you're going to walk around more, but like naturally, right? It may still be your preference that you would have driven, but because of the extenuating circumstances, you don't, right? And that's what that's the kind of the thing that Nail Cannon's like talking about here.
And a lot of people
the
don't
way
drive in New York
which
City.
The cities are
They
the way
take
in which
public
like a
transit.
city or a town is constructed, or the types of policies that impact an area are going to change the ways in which people behave, regardless of what their actual preferences are.
Yeah, I'm not saying preference is absent your environment, but if the fact that you have a choice means that you have a preference.
Yeah, but that's like, it's almost reductionary to a point that it doesn't actually provide any meaningful.
Like you use the point of New York. Some people rather get up later in the day and have a 15-minute commute to work by taking the train, even though there's crazy fucking people down there. Oh, and rats, rather than walk above ground for an hour.
And left it.
Why would I choose a worse alternative?
That's that's a great
Because
point.
it's your preference.
Is your preference? You
My
fucking
preference to
retard?
choose the better option for me. Okay.
That is not a hard concept to
absolutely.
fucking
It's
understand,
Like
dude.
so,
It's like,
so.
Do I choose
Wow.
to like walk on the rake and get hit in the fucking head with the handle? No, that's my preference. Not to
Yeah,
fucking do
like
that.
holy shit! Why would I do that? Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay, so what's worse, living in the country, so living is low, but there's not, or living in
You cut out. You
You
cut
cut
out.
out.
what's
on
worse,
the
living in the
point again.
country where the cost of living is low, but there's not as many services, or living in the city where everything's really expensive, but everything's a block away and you can get to it.
You need to fix your microphone.
I couldn't hear like a lot of the details.
Yeah,
but,
I got what you meant. Like it's entirely a preference, right? Do you give a shit about what's going on in the city, right? I prefer peace. I prefer space, right? I'm not a city person.
Right, but people that are choosing preferences are still choosing what's best for them. Like the existence
Yeah.
of a preference doesn't imply that there's more than one correct choice for you. Because
Yeah,
part
correct,
of what
yeah.
it means to have preferences means that there's different people with different needs that evaluate things in different ways. So even if to you there's one obvious choice, and it's like, why would I choose anything other than that? Doesn't mean that the concept of preference is negated, because maybe somebody else made that choice because they get a different circumstance.
Like there's
Right,
old
but
ladies who
to be
choose
clear,
to
defining
fucking choose to
any
walk
given
everywhere.
choice as like a result of your preferences is kind of like a bad way of looking at it. So, because the truth is, if you had an abundance of resources such that you had more available options, the way in which you actually make your decisions day to day are going to be different, right? If I had a shit ton of money, because I live in New York City, right? If I had a shit ton of money, maybe I would Uber places more often, right?
Nope.
So that and well, no, it's not a nope. It
is because I make really good
No.
money and I live right above Section 8 housing. And you know why? Because I have a preference to save my money rather than take Uber and have like Uber Eats delivered to my door.
I wasn't talking about you.
But but that's the thing. Your preference would be to like take advantage in the immediate sense what your higher income gives you.
No, Grant, you're just afraid of an Indian.
No. What I'm saying is that the prep, like, if we simply, because so earlier, right, you were saying that like you're basically describing any given choice that a person makes about their day-to-day life as necessarily their preference. And what I'm saying is a preference is more about like at the root of things, which if given like the total freedom and capacity to do whatever you wanted, which thing would you choose? Which thing like in accordance with your core values that you think is like the better
That's
thing
not what
to
preference
do.
means.
Yes, it is.
If you have more than one choice and you pick one, that's your preference.
There are objective
Right.
facts we can apply to different choices in some cases.
You don't have
right, that make them
infinite
an obviously worse choice, right? Right?
For some people. But
So
the examples that we've
pain-
examined, the examples we've examined so far aren't always the same for every person's preference. Some people value walking the longer route to work in New York because they want to get their steps in. Some people have a preference for the time they can serve and being able to get home to play Call of Duty when they get back.
If I have the choice, right, between two paths of equal distance and all else equal, right, aside from the fact that one of these paths is covered in glass, and I'm not allowed to wear shoes in either existence, right, I'm not going to choose the path of the glass, right?
And yet
You
some
can
people
have
do.
a preference. So, right, but there are exceptions to the rule. They don't
Well, no,
define
the
rules.
preference here, Nail Cannon, would just simply be that you wanted to avoid pain.
I mean, I guess.
Or you didn't think
yeah.
or you didn't think the pain that you thought you're assuming, like you have a fear that you're going to get mugged on your way to work. Maybe some people don't see it that way.
Okay, fine. I know for a fact. Okay, it's a hypothetical, right? I know for a fact that if I choose the first path, I'm gonna get stabbed, right? Very lightly, very mildly, but every single day I'm gonna get
Hold on,
stabbed.
why are you going all the way to that extreme to build this preference from what we were using as examples?
Because I want to establish the base case that there is a choice that can be made in a worse way.
Is that true for everything we've talked about so far?
I want to establish the base case so that we can establish where the line is afterwards.
Yeah, you can have a preference for being stabbed or not stabbed.
Right, but the root, like the core value that you're really coming down to here is your preference towards like pleasure or pain, right? So in the same way that like the decision to walk to work versus
How
take a
is walking
subway,
to work
or if
versus
you had an
saving time
abundance
taking
of
public
wealth, you might
transit
take
a
Uber.
preference to
The
pleasure
preference
or
would be
pain?
in reference to the thing that you find most convenient, cross-indexed with like
Tell
however
me
much
how we're
money you're
talking
willing to
about
spend
a
on
preference for a pleasure or pain when we're talking about just time saving and getting your steps in.
Because in my case, right,
Well,
that
his thing was
the example
about
of the path,
walking on
the
glass.
example of the path with the glass is the effectively having to walk outside in fucking Florida and during the summer, right? That is pain, right? It is not pleasurable. There's nothing enjoyable about it. Some
So
people
I'm
may
a
have- some
hiker.
people
So
may
I'm
have
a hiker.
better-
I go on the Appalachian Trail all the time when it's like 100 degrees. I do it anyways.
Congratulations, you're an exception. Enjoy your anecdotal evidence.
Well, there's other people
Yeah.
out there during that time. That's crazy.
We talk about generalities. We talk about
Aren't there people that specifically move to Florida in the summer?
Yeah.
because they don't like
those
they stay in
people
their air
are
conditioned
what we would call masochists. The
Yeah,
base
also-
people are the ones that move to
they-
Florida during the winter so that they can avoid winter in
Yeah, we have the snow. They come so they can avoid the objectively worst life of being snowed in, right? They come to Florida when it's not hot as fuck, right? Where there's the objectively better
Dude, there's
time
like fucking
than Florida
Pakistan.
in the summer.
Dude, hold on. I have one more thing I want to say.
They're literally
There are freaking
optimizing their life for
This is
best
actually
times.
really relevant to what you're saying. There are Pakis that live right next door to me. Like they're everywhere where I live because I live right outside DC. They turn up the freaking heat in the summer. They love the heat. I don't know what the fuck's wrong with their or they open the door and let their kids out. You get blasted like a punch of hot air.
So in a controlled environment, like say a video game where there's an absolutely finite number of choices, right? Because it's a controlled environment, there is such a thing as a false choice, right? Like you can imagine, okay, you're playing a video game and your character can either equip the hat that gives a +1 bonus or the hat that gives a +2 bonus, and both hats look exactly the same, right? Like bad design can lead to false choices. So the question is, are there false choices in the open environment of real life where it's like, yeah, technically you have the choice to jump into the volcano or not.
Yeah, you
but it's a fault.
have the to make a worse decision, right? That doesn't make it not a worse decision.
Right. So, if we say that there's a scenario, because it's a controlled environment, where literally everybody would prefer a certain thing, does that negate the concept of preference?
I mean, why do people jump off of fucking skyscrapers and kill themselves?
I have to say the example of Pakistanis.
Yeah, so
Dude, I'm just saying, like they are literally like 100 feet down the hall, dude.
The main thing that's like important to just recognize here is that like when talking about things like preference, it's always about like cross-indexing it relative to whatever the other option might be, or whatever like the abundance of choices are. So and like in a realistic sense, right? Which is why I bring up like the paying for the Uber as an example, right? If you have abundance, and if going on a vacation is a thing that you could do willy-nilly, right? And you don't have a job, like how you spend your week, are you telling me that like just because like I might go to fucking Mykonos for the week or something because I can, right? But then somebody else chooses to just like go for a walk in the park in like their local town, that their preference is to go for the walk and my preference is to go to Mykonos? Or is it the case that both of us probably have a preference towards like some fantastical thing, but like only one of us actually has the capacity to
But
do
you see,
that
when you're
thing?
talking about the real world, right? Because you say all else equal, but when we're talking about the real world,
I didn't say all else equal.
Okay, then let's just talk about the real world then. So
I am talking about the real world.
there are no solutions. There are trade-offs, right?
Right.
Okay.
That's what I'm saying.
So in the real world, if I choose to get pleasure out of one thing, I'm giving up pleasure from everything else.
Well, no, you're giving up pleasure relative to the things you had access to, not everything else.
Everything else you have access to.
Right. Yeah, we agree.
Right, and everything you would have to pay to get access to that thing, and sometimes paying for it is just the time.
Yep.
So everything I said is correct.
So this is interesting because
because the main point here is that like, so I consider preferences as a higher order like way to examine like the nature of people's desires, right? So if the only thing that you want to say is, given all, like 1,000 specific qualities of a person, and here's the limited list of options that they have, what thing would they do? Well, sure, right? That just tells us about like the choices someone would make given their circumstance. But when we're talking about like a preference, what we're really talking about is something deeper, which is, what is the thing they truly want deep down?
What if my preference is to live forever? I mean, like,
that is a preference that you hold.
It sounds like there's foolishness to be had on both extremes here, right? Like on the one hand, saying that someone owns their choice when their choices are between, you know, work in the salt mines or be hanged is facetious. But
right.
If someone has a choice between like walking in the park or walking on the beach or staying home in the air conditioning, and they choose to stay home in the air conditioning, you say, well, that's your preference. And they say, well, no, actually my preference is to be living in a space station that's orbiting Jupiter, like stare at the red spot of Jupiter. That would be kind of facetious too. Both of these terms can be.
I'd be happy to continue.
You're mixing two things in my head now, Aggie. When I'm talking about preference, I'm not talking about realistic desire, right? I'm talking about, even if I'm consciously or unconsciously doing a thing, right? As long as I am in control of the situation that I've been put in, I am going to do my preference, right? Now, it might be a lesser of two evils things, right? Like, I don't want to save one life or the other, like a trolley scenario or something like that, but I do my preference, right? Or in that scenario, you could imagine something where I spin a wheel and I randomly pick things, but that was my preference to do that. That's what I mean at the level of preference. When I mean like logical desire or something like that, there's another term we could come up with for that, meaning that given the circumstances that I imagine I could be in, what would I do? And that's different.
I think you and I agree, Grunt, on like on this thing that we're distinguishing here, right? But for some reason it seems like you also baked into like preference as you kind of baked in like the logical choice part as well when you said the phrase things that you have control over.
Mm-hmm.
So I actually am struggling that's where I think the difference in like the way that we're engaging with this is, right? I'm saying that it's not even about the things that you can have control over, right? In a lot of cases, a preference isn't actually a thing that you control to begin with. right? In the same way that like I can't really control the like types of people that I'm attracted to, right? Like I prefer like fit girls, right? Like it's not like a thing that I control. We also don't control like necessarily what type of food we have in like the supermarket that we shop at, right? And so like because of our
It
limited
sounded like
access,
you just with the example you just gave there is like I can't control what I'm attracted to. That just said I don't have preference for my preference. That's what I heard.
It sounds like you got. It sounds like
You
one of
don't-
you is
well,
defining. It sounds
no,
like
I
one
could
of
have
you is
I could have a
defining-
preference for what my preference would be, but I don't have control of what the preference is, right? In one way, I could say, right, like I might say, like there was a time in my life, right, where I wasn't like getting any, where I was thinking like, man, it'd be so much simpler if I was gay, right? Like shit like that, right? But the truth is, like, I don't think I actually preferred being gay necessarily, but the like,
Yeah, it wasn't your preference.
it wasn't my preference necessarily, but like I preferred the world where like access to sex was really easy, and so I could like evaluate that scenario.
Okay.
But like,
imagine
but I still
that there's-
prefer like women if we're talking about
imagine-
like the deep down preference that I don't control, right?
Imagine that there's a person that desires, or they're like a fat ass. They weigh 450 pounds, and like in their dreams and their desires, they're fucking He-Man swinging on banging broad, like running marathon, and all that shit that they can't
Good
do.
for them. Yeah.
Okay, but they don't do anything to achieve that. They do not work out. They do not get out of the chair. They don't put down the birthday cake. And this is a question for both of you. So in this scenario, does the guy prefer to be fat?
Whatever the way you describe like their dream thing, that's their preference. It seems.
Do you agree, Grunt?
So there's two preferences there. There's the preference that if I just given like no effort, my preference in imaginary land is not to be fat, but my